The ocean off the island of Samar was calm on the morning of October 25, 1944. It was the kind of tropical stillness that usually precedes a storm. But the men of Task Unit 77.4.3, known by their call sign Taffy 3, weren't looking at the weather. They were drinking coffee, eating powdered eggs, and preparing for another routine day of anti-submarine patrols and ground support for the troops fighting on Leyte. To the sailors aboard the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, the war felt surprisingly distant that morning. They were the backbenchers of the Pacific War. Their task unit wasn't the mighty Third Fleet with its fast battleships and fleet carriers. Taffy 3 was a collection of jeep carriers, slow, converted merchant ships carrying a handful of planes, and their screen of tin-can destroyers. They were unarmored, undergunned, and utterly expendable. They were the security guards of the Navy, designed to hunt submarines and shoot down stray planes, not to fight a surface war. They sat 60 miles offshore, comfortable in the knowledge that Admiral Halsey and the main American battle fleet were guarding the north, standing between them and the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were safe, or so they thought. At 6:45, a lookout on the fantail of the Johnston squinted into the horizon. He saw flashes of light. At first, he thought it was lightning from a distant squall. Then he saw the anti-aircraft bursts. Then he saw the masts. They were not the familiar lattice masts of American ships. They were distinct, towering pagoda structures rising like jagged skyscrapers from the sea. They belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. And they weren't just a few ships. It was the main body of the Japanese fleet, a force that American intelligence had declared defeated and retreating just the day before. There were 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest, most heavily armed warship in human history, displacing nearly 70,000 tons and carrying guns that fired shells the weight of a compact car. Flanking them were 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In total, the Japanese force weighed nearly 400,000 tons. Taffy 3 weighed less than 50,000. It was not a battle formation. It was an execution squad, and they had caught the Americans completely by surprise. On the bridge of the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans lowered his binoculars. Evans was a man who seemed carved from granite. Born in Oklahoma with Cherokee and Creek heritage, he had faced prejudice his entire life to earn his commission. He was not a textbook officer. He was aggressive, rough-edged, and possessed a warrior spirit that unsettled even his own crew. When the Johnston was commissioned, Evans had gathered his men on the fantail and delivered a speech that violated every rule of naval caution. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he had told them. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one had left. Now, staring at the silhouette of the Yamato on the horizon, Evans realized that his promise had come due. The math was impossible. The Japanese ships were faster. The Yamato alone could outrun the escort carriers. They had guns that could vaporize a destroyer from 20 miles away. The Johnston's 5-inch guns had a maximum effective range of maybe 10 miles. If the Japanese fleet reached the slow, defenseless carriers, it would be a massacre. Thousands of American sailors and pilots would die. The invasion of the Philippines would be jeopardized. Most commanders in Evans's position would have done the logical thing: make smoke, run at full speed, and pray that the carriers could escape into a rain squall. The doctrine for a destroyer facing a battleship is simple: survive. But Ernest Evans did not operate by doctrine. He operated by a code of honor that predated the U.S. Navy. He knew that time was the only currency that mattered. Every minute he could delay the Japanese was a minute the carriers used to escape, and he knew the price of that time was his ship. Without waiting for orders from the task unit commander, without consulting his executive officer, Evans grabbed the squawk box and barked a command that stunned the helmsman. "Left full rudder, all engines ahead flank." The Johnston did not run away. She turned violently, heeling over as her propellers bit into the water and charged straight at the Japanese fleet. It was a suicidal maneuver. It was a single 2,000-ton destroyer sprinting alone toward 4 battleships and 8 cruisers. It was a mouse charging a pack of lions. On the Japanese bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita must have been baffled. He saw a lone American destroyer break formation and rush toward him, zigzagging through the water, spewing black smoke to hide the carriers. To the Japanese, this aggression suggested that the Johnston must be the vanguard of a much larger force. They hesitated, recalculating. That hesitation was Evans's first victory. As the Johnston closed the distance, the ocean around her erupted. The Japanese battleships opened fire. These weren't standard shells. They were using dye-coated markers to spot their fall of shot. The water around the Johnston was torn apart by geysers of pink, green, and yellow water, beautiful and terrifying. These were 14-inch and 18-inch shells. A single hit would not just sink the Johnston, it would disintegrate her. Evans stood on the open bridge, unprotected, barking course changes. "Chase the splashes!" he yelled. He steered the ship toward the geysers of water where the last shells had landed, gambling that the Japanese gunners would correct their aim and not hit the same spot twice. The ship shuddered and groaned as the engines were pushed beyond their safety limits, screaming toward 30 knots. They were closing the range. 10 miles, 9 miles, 8 miles. The crew of the Johnston worked in a frenzy. In the gun mounts, sailors, shirtless and sweating, heaved 55-pound shells into the breeches of the 5-inch guns. They knew they were outranged, but they fired anyway, desperate to land a punch. Finally, at 18,000 yards, the Johnston's guns found their mark. They weren't aiming at the battleships. Their shells would bounce off the Yamato's armor like pebbles. They targeted the heavy cruiser Kumano, the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division. The Johnston's computer-controlled fire system locked on. Hundreds of 5-inch shells poured out of the destroyer, turning the superstructure of the Kumano into a burning wreck. They were stripping the cruiser's bridge, killing its officers, starting fires that raged across its deck. It was David stinging Goliath in the eye. But Evans wasn't there to trade gunfire. He was there to deliver his knockout punch: torpedoes. The Johnston carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. They were her only weapon capable of sinking a capital ship. To use them, Evans had to get within 10,000 yards, point-blank range in naval warfare. He held his fire, watching the range counter drop. The air was filled with the scream of incoming steel. Shrapnel pinged off the hull like hail. The water was boiling with explosions. At 10,000 yards, Evans gave the order, "Fire torpedoes!" The torpedoes splashed into the water, their motors hissing as they raced toward the Kumano. Evans didn't wait to see the result. He immediately ordered a hard turn back into the smokescreen. As the Johnston retreated into the white fog, a massive underwater explosion rocked the ocean. One of the torpedoes had blown the bow off the Kumano. The heavy cruiser, a ship 10 times the size of the Johnston, shuddered to a halt, crippled and out of the fight. A cheer went up through the destroyer. They had done the impossible. They had charged the entire Japanese fleet, crippled a cruiser, and survived. But the Japanese were done being surprised. As the Johnston emerged from the smoke, attempting to rejoin the formation, the battleship Congo found the range. This time, there was no missing. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship slammed into the Johnston. They didn't explode inside. The destroyer's armor was so thin, the armor-piercing shells passed right through her like a needle through paper. But they tore massive holes in the hull and wrecked the machinery spaces. Moments later, 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser struck the bridge. The devastation was absolute. The aft boiler room was destroyed. The engine room was a wreck. The Johnston's speed dropped from 30 knots to 17. The gyro compass was dead. The steering engine was severed. The ship was listing, burning, and bleeding oil into the sea. On the bridge, the scene was horrific. The cruiser shells had killed or wounded almost everyone. Commander Evans had been hit. 2 fingers on his left hand were blown off, dangling by shreds of skin. Shrapnel had embedded in his chest and face. His uniform was soaked in blood. By all logic of war, the Johnston was finished. She was crippled, half her power gone, her captain mutilated, her guns damaged. The standard procedure now was to abandon ship or, at the very least, limp away to the south and try to save the crew. The Japanese fleet was pressing in, smelling blood. The other destroyers of Taffy 3, the Hole and the Heermann, were now launching their own desperate attacks, trying to buy time. Evans could have honorably withdrawn. He had done his duty. He had led the charge. But Ernest Evans wrapped a handkerchief around the bloody stumps of his fingers. He refused medical attention. He pulled himself upright on the ruined bridge. He realized that the steering was gone, so he ordered men to the aft steering compartment to control the rudder manually. He had to shout commands down a voice pipe to men in the bowels of the ship who were steering blind. He looked at his executive officer, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. The escort carriers were still too close. The Japanese were still coming. The job wasn't done. "Captain," a lieutenant asked, looking at the devastation, "orders?" Evans looked at the approaching Japanese destroyers, a squadron of them lining up to finish off the American carriers. He looked at his broken ship. He didn't order a retreat. He didn't order damage control to prepare for evacuation. "All engines ahead," Evans said, his voice raspy but steady. "We're going back in." The Johnston, smoking, limping, and half dead, turned her bow once again toward the heavy cruisers and battleships of the Imperial Navy. She had fired all her torpedoes. She was running on one engine. But she became something more dangerous than a warship that morning. She became a distraction. Evans began to maneuver his broken ship directly into the line of fire, placing himself between the Japanese and the fleeing carriers. He began to duel with ships that outweighed him by 40,000 tons, firing his remaining guns manually, closing the range, daring them to kill him. He was no longer fighting to survive. He was fighting to die as slowly and loudly as possible, to force the Japanese to waste time killing him instead of the carriers. The legend of the Johnston wasn't written in her first charge. It was written in what came next, when a bleeding captain and a doomed crew decided that they would take the entire Japanese Navy down with them. By 0830, the USS Johnston was no longer fighting a naval battle. She was fighting a brawl in a burning house. The ship was a wreck. Her bridge was smashed, her masts were snapped, and she was listing heavily to port. Blood slicked the decks, mixing with oil and seawater. Below decks, the damage control parties were working in waist-deep water, shoring up bulkheads in darkness, lit only by the terrifying flashes of enemy shell impacts. But Commander Ernest Evans was not done. He had promised his crew that he would go in harm's way, and he intended to stay there until the ocean claimed him. From his position on the fantail, having been forced to command from the rear of the ship because the forward bridge was destroyed, Evans spotted a new threat. The Japanese fleet, frustrated by the stubborn resistance of the American tin cans, was changing tactics. A squadron of Japanese destroyers, led by the light cruiser Yahagi, was swinging around the flank. Their intent was clear: bypass the annoyance of the Johnston and launch a mass torpedo attack against the slow, fat escort carriers of Taffy 3. If those torpedoes hit the water, the carriers were dead. The Johnston had no torpedoes left. She had expended them all in her first suicidal charge. Her main engines were failing. Her radar was gone. She had nothing left but 5-inch guns and a captain who refused to accept physics. Evans shouted into the voice tube, ordering the helm to bring the ship around. He was going to intercept the entire Japanese destroyer squadron. It was a move of pure tactical insanity. A crippled, single-engine destroyer was going to cross the T of a fresh enemy squadron. Evans intended to sail directly across their path, forcing them to turn and engage him, spoiling their aim at the carriers. He was offering his ship as a physical shield, a slab of steel to catch the bullets meant for others. As the Johnston limped into the path of the Yahagi and her 4 escorting destroyers, the Japanese commanders must have been bewildered. This American ship was a ruin, trailing smoke and flame. Yet it was firing its guns with the rhythmic precision of a metronome. Evans ordered his gunnery officer, Bob Hagan, to fire at anything that moved. The Johnston's 5-inch shells hammered the Yahagi, hitting her multiple times. The Japanese cruiser, startled by the ferocity of the dead ship, turned its guns on Evans. The Japanese destroyers followed suit. Suddenly, the entire squadron abandoned their run on the carriers and focused their fury on the Johnston. Evans had won. He had drawn their fire. He had bought the carriers another 10 minutes of life. But the cost was imminent annihilation. The Japanese destroyers closed in like a pack of wolves encircling a wounded bear. They were so close that the American sailors could see the faces of the Japanese officers on their bridges. The air around the Johnston became a solid wall of steel. Shells from 5 different ships slammed into her simultaneously. The main deck was ripped open. The 40mm anti-aircraft guns were blown off their mounts. The forward gun turret took a direct hit, killing everyone inside. Yet, incredibly, the Johnston kept firing. In the number 5 gun mount, a sailor named Robert Hollenbaugh kept loading shells manually. When the electrical systems failed, the crew cranked the heavy turret by hand. When the hoist failed, they passed 55-pound shells up from the magazine in a human chain, sweat and blood running down their backs. They were firing at battleships, cruisers, and destroyers indiscriminately. They were, in the words of a survivor, boxing with God. For 30 minutes, the Johnston held the line alone. She absorbed punishment that would have sunk a cruiser. The Japanese battleships, looming in the fog, added their heavy-caliber fire to the mix. The Johnston was being hit from all sides. Commander Evans, shirtless, covered in bandages, his left hand useless, stood amidst the wreckage, shouting encouragement to his men. He was seen calmly walking through shrapnel showers, directing fire, seemingly immune to the fear that should have paralyzed him. He was no longer just a commander. He was the avatar of the ship's fighting spirit. But physics eventually won. At 09:45, a final salvo destroyed the remaining engine. The Johnston lost all power. The pumps stopped. The lights died. The ship coasted to a halt, dead in the water, surrounded by the enemy. The Japanese destroyers closed to point-blank range. They formed a firing circle around the drifting hulk, pumping shell after shell into her hull, practicing target practice on the dying beast. They poured fire into the bridge, the funnel, the waterline. The Johnston was being disassembled rivet by rivet. With no power to the guns and the ship settling rapidly by the bow, Evans knew the end had come. At 09:50, he gave the order. All hands, abandon ship. It was an orderly evacuation into hell. Men jumped into the oil-slicked water, clutching life jackets and debris. The water was warm, but the ocean was vast and terrifying. As the crew scrambled off the fantail, the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze steamed slowly past the sinking Johnston. It came so close that the American survivors in the water braced themselves for machine gun fire, expecting to be massacred. Instead, they witnessed something that would become part of naval legend. On the bridge of the Yukikaze, the Japanese captain stood at attention. As he passed the burning, sinking wreck of the Johnston, he raised his hand and saluted. It was a gesture of profound respect from one warrior to another. The Japanese had recognized that they weren't fighting a mere machine. They had fought a crew of impossible courage. As the destroyer pulled away, a Japanese sailor on the deck was seen throwing a can of peaches and a roll of bandages to the Americans in the water. At 10:10 a.m., the USS Johnston rolled over and slid beneath the waves of the Pacific, taking 186 men with her. Among the missing was Commander Ernest Evans. Survivors reported seeing him on the fantail as the ship went down, helping men into the water. Others said they saw him drifting away on a piece of wreckage, but he was never seen again. He had kept his promise. He had gone in harm's way, and he had not returned. But the Johnston's sacrifice had not been in vain. The ferocity of Taffy 3's defense, the tin-can destroyers charging battleships, the escort carriers launching planes until they ran out of fuel, had achieved a miracle. Admiral Kurita, commanding the massive Japanese fleet, was shaken. He had lost 2 cruisers. His fleet was scattered. He believed he was facing a massive American task force, not a handful of escort ships. The aggression of Evans and his men convinced the Japanese High Command that they were sailing into a trap. At 12:36 p.m., with the American carriers practically within his grasp, Kurita gave the order to turn around. The Japanese fleet retreated. The invasion of Leyte was safe. The useless destroyers had turned back the pride of the Imperial Navy. For the survivors of the Johnston, the battle was over, but the ordeal was just beginning. Due to a series of communication errors and the chaos of the battle, the Navy didn't know exactly where the ship had gone down. The men floated in the shark-infested waters for 50 hours. They had no fresh water, no food, and very few life rafts. Delirium set in. Men hallucinated ships coming to save them and swam away, only to drown. Sharks picked off the stragglers, their screams piercing the night. Through it all, the survivors clung to the memory of their captain. They told stories of Evans charging the Yamato. They held on to each other, united by the shared trauma of the impossible battle they had just fought. When rescue ships finally arrived 2 days later, only 141 of the Johnston's crew of 327 were pulled from the sea alive. The legacy of the USS Johnston is unparalleled in the history of the United States Navy. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the first Native American sailor to receive the nation's highest military honor. His citation reads like a fiction novel, describing a man who fought with unsurpassed gallantry against overwhelmed odds. But perhaps the greatest tribute came not from medals, but from the analysis of the battle itself. Historians often refer to the battle off Samar as the greatest mismatch in naval history. It was a battle that the Americans should have lost in minutes. That they didn't, that they actually won, is largely credited to the psychological shock delivered by Ernest Evans. He broke the enemy's will by proving that Americans would fight to the death even when the situation was hopeless. Decades later, in 2021, an undersea expedition finally located the wreck of the USS Johnston. She lies 4 miles deep in the Philippine Trench, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. The images sent back by the submersible showed a battered hull, guns still trained outward, defiant even in the crushing darkness of the abyss. It is a steel tomb for the men who refused to run. Ernest Evans once said, "The destroyer is a fighting ship." He proved it. In an era of massive battleships and aircraft carriers, he showed that the most dangerous weapon on the ocean isn't the size of the gun or the thickness of the armor. It is the heart of the captain. The USS Johnston was a tin can, a disposable escort, a speck on the map. But for 2 hours on an October morning in 1944, she cast a shadow longer than the Yamato. She fought like a battleship, and she died like a legend. If you ever doubt the impact of a single individual's refusal to quit, remember the Johnston. Remember the captain with the bloody hand who turned his burning ship around and charged into the teeth of the storm, simply because it was his duty. That is the price of victory. That is the definition of a hero.